Vanessa smirked, running a hand through my hair as if she owned me, as if she believed she had me wrapped around her perfectly manicured finger. "You'll never leave. You need me," she whispered, her voice dripping with condescension. I just smiled. I let the moment stretch, let her soak in her own arrogance. If only she knew. The next morning, Vanessa woke up expecting the same life she had always known: silk sheets, designer robes, and the certainty that she was the one in control. But this morning was different. The house was eerily silent, too silent. She stretched out her arm to my side of the bed, but all she felt was cold emptiness. That was the first sign, but it wasn't until she patted across the hardwood floor and stepped into the hallway that the dread began to set in. Her first instinct was to check the closet. It was empty. Not a single suit, not a single pair of polished shoes, not a trace of me left. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She turned, breathing heavily, her pulse quickening as she rushed down the stairs, expecting to find me sipping coffee, reading the news, waiting for her like always. The kitchen was spotless, but something was missing. No, everything was missing. The coffee machine, the designer bar stools, the expensive chandelier that had once illuminated our morning conversations, gone. It wasn't until she turned toward the living room that her breath hitched in her throat. The grand piano, the custom-made leather couch, the painting she had hand-picked. Everything had vanished. The house wasn't just empty, it had been gutted, leaving behind only cold walls and the echoes of a life she had taken for granted. Panic surged through her veins as she sprinted to her purse, fumbling for her phone. Her hands shook as she tapped the banking app. The loading screen felt like an eternity, her breath shallow and uneven. When the balance appeared, her world zero. No, that had to be a mistake. She refreshed the screen once, twice, 3 times, but nothing changed. A strangled sound escaped her throat as she opened her savings account. Empty. Her credit cards declined. It was then that she saw it, a single envelope resting on the kitchen counter, pristine against the barren room. With trembling fingers, she picked it up, dreading what it would say. "Turns out I never needed you, but you needed me." And just like that, Vanessa's perfect world crumbled. Vanessa stood frozen, her pulse thundering in her ears as she clutched the note with trembling fingers. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. This had to be some kind of joke, a cruel prank. Any moment now, Jason would walk through the door, shaking his head, telling her this was just to teach her a lesson, but the silence that stretched through the empty house was deafening. She bolted toward the front door, throwing it open with force, half expecting to see his car still parked in the driveway, maybe one of his bags left behind. But there was nothing. Not his car, not even the faintest sign that he had ever lived here. The realization settled like ice in her stomach. He was gone, truly gone, and he had taken everything with him. Her mind raced, scrambling for an answer, a way out of this nightmare. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling over the screen as she tried to call Jason. The first ring felt like hope. The second rang out longer. The third confirmed what she feared. Straight to voicemail. Her throat constricted as she redialed, willing him to pick up. Again, voicemail. She tried again and again, but it was as if he had erased himself from her world. Gritting her teeth, she turned to her contacts, scrolling past names she hadn't needed in years. Friends, associates, people who always had her back. She pressed the call button on her closest friend, Lisa. Surely Lisa would understand, would help her figure out how to fix this. But the call rang and rang before a mechanical voice announced, "This number is no longer in service." Vanessa's blood ran cold. She tried another friend and another. Each call ended the same way: voicemail, disconnected, silent. Her hands shook as she opened her text messages, scrolling frantically. The last messages from some of her so-called friends were distant, impersonal, nothing like before. The people who had once filled her life with invitations, compliments, and endless plans were suddenly nowhere to be found. Jason hadn't just left, he had severed her from everything. She swallowed hard, trying to push back the rising panic. This couldn't be real. This was just a temporary setback. She needed to get to the bank to fix whatever mistake had emptied her accounts. Grabbing her car keys, she stormed out of the house and sped toward her bank, barely stopping at red lights, her mind buzzing with desperation. The moment she stepped inside, she hurried to the nearest teller, slamming her hands on the counter. "I need to check my accounts," she demanded, her voice wavering between anger and fear. There's been some kind of mistake. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, nodded politely and pulled up Vanessa's information. A moment passed, then another. The woman's brows furrowed as she double-checked the screen. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Daniels," she said hesitantly, "but your accounts have been closed." Vanessa's stomach lurched. "That's impossible," she snapped. "There's money in those accounts. A lot of money." The teller gave her an apologetic look. "Your husband requested the closure last week. He had full authorization." Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. Last week, he had been planning this for days, maybe even weeks, and she had been too blind to see it. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as if denying it would make it untrue. "There has to be something left." The teller hesitated before adding, "A final transaction was made to settle outstanding debts. There's nothing left." Debts? What debts? Jason had always handled the finances, made sure everything was covered. She never needed to worry about money. He had been successful, wealthy, more than capable of maintaining their lifestyle. Unless her knees nearly buckled as the thought hit her. Unless all of it had been a lie. She staggered back from the counter, the walls of the bank suddenly feeling too close, too suffocating. Jason hadn't just left her, he had dismantled her life, piece by piece, leaving her with nothing. No money, no house, no friends, no safety net. The reality of her situation pressed down on her like an unbearable weight. She had spent years believing she was untouchable, that Jason would always be the one waiting in the background, too weak to ever walk away. But she had underestimated him, and now she was truly, devastatingly alone. Vanessa staggered out of the bank, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor as if mocking her with every step. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and for the first time in years she felt small, powerless. The people around her moved with purpose, their lives intact, their future secure, while hers had just collapsed in the span of a single morning. She pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped outside into the unforgiving sunlight. The heat pressed down on her, suffocating as if the world itself was closing in. Her hands trembled as she gripped her phone once more, scrolling through her messages with frantic desperation. There had to be someone who would answer, someone who would help. But as she scanned the list of contacts, a sickening realization settled in her gut. The friends she had prided herself on, the ones who had always been by her side at high society parties, charity galas, and expensive vacations, they weren't answering. They weren't ignoring her by accident, they were avoiding her on purpose. Vanessa clenched her jaw, willing herself not to cry. She had built her world on the illusion of control, of influence, of always having the upper hand. But Jason had dismantled it overnight. And now she was grasping at the remains of a life that no longer existed. With a deep, unsteady breath, she forced herself to move. She needed answers, she needed money, she needed to fix this before it spiraled further out of control. Her car was still parked where she had left it, gleaming under the bright morning sun. She slid into the driver's seat and gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The logical thing to do was to go home, to take a moment to breathe, to figure out her next move. But the thought of returning to that empty shell of a house, stripped of everything that had made it a home, made her stomach churn. Instead, she drove. She wasn't sure where she was going at first, only that she needed to escape, to outrun the panic clawing at her chest. But as the familiar streets passed by, her mind settled on a destination, her lover's apartment. Caleb. He had promised her a future, whispered in her ear that she deserved better, that she shouldn't be tied down to a man like Jason. He had been her secret escape, the thrill she had indulged in when she had grown bored of playing the dutiful wife. Now, she needed him more than ever. By the time she reached his building, her heart was pounding, not with excitement, but with a gnawing sense of unease. She had never come here unannounced before. She had always been careful, always in control. But today, she had no choice. She pressed the buzzer and waited, shifting anxiously on her feet. A few moments later, a voice crackled through the intercom. Vanessa's stomach dropped. It wasn't Caleb's voice. Hi, I'm looking for Caleb, she said, trying to keep her tone steady. A pause. Then the voice, female this time, answered flatly, Caleb's not here. Vanessa frowned. Can you tell me when he'll be back? This is important. Another pause, this one heavier, tinged with something Vanessa couldn't quite place. Then the woman on the other end laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Honey, Caleb moved out weeks ago. The world tilted. No, that's not possible, Vanessa stammered. I just saw him. Then I guess you were seeing a ghost, the woman said, because he packed his bags and left. And if you're the Vanessa you used to talk about, he told me to give you a message if you ever showed up. Vanessa's throat tightened. What message? It was fun while it lasted. The call disconnected with a sharp beep, leaving Vanessa standing there, her phone still clutched in her shaking hand. Caleb had left, just like Jason. She stumbled back, the weight of it all finally crashing over her. It had been a lie. Not just her marriage, but everything. The affair, the promises, the idea that she was untouchable. She had built her entire life on the belief that she could have it all, play the game without consequence. But Jason had been playing too, and he had won. She felt a hot tear slide down her cheek, but she wiped it away furiously. No, she wouldn't break down. Not here, not now. She still had options. Or did she? Her accounts were empty, her friends had abandoned her lover had disappeared without a trace. The first real wave of fear hit her then, not just panic, but deep, soul-crushing terror. For the first time in her life, Vanessa had nothing, no safety net, no one to turn to. And worst of all, no idea what to do next. Vanessa stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at her phone screen as if willing it to change reality. The words still echoed in her mind. It was fun while it lasted. Caleb had discarded her like an old toy, just as easily as he had lured her into believing she had options beyond Jason. The realization burned deep. She had spent so much time thinking she was the one in control, juggling a husband and a lover, playing both sides, ensuring her life remained cushioned in luxury. But now she was standing outside an apartment that no longer belonged to Caleb, with no money, no security, and no way out of the mess she had created. The heat pressed down on her as she walked aimlessly to her car, her mind racing. She needed a plan. She had always prided herself on being resourceful, on knowing how to manipulate situations to her advantage, but this was different. Jason had planned this meticulously, stripping her of everything in one fell swoop. He hadn't just left, he had made sure she had nothing left to fall back on. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she sat in the car, breathing hard. There was still one place she could turn to. Her parents? It wasn't ideal. She had distanced herself from them over the years, always making it clear that she had outgrown their simple, middle-class way of life. They had never truly approved of her lifestyle, nor of the way she had treated Jason, but they were family. And if there was ever a time to cash in on that connection, it was now. She drove through the city in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The sprawling suburbs soon gave way to a more modest neighborhood, the kind she had once been desperate to escape. Rows of identical houses with well-kept lawns lined the street, a stark contrast to the luxury estates she had grown used to. As she pulled into the driveway of her childhood home, an uncomfortable wave of nostalgia washed over her. She hadn't been here in years. Not for holidays, not for birthdays. Her parents had always been an afterthought, an obligation. And yet, here she was, hoping they would welcome her with open arms. She stepped onto the porch and rang the doorbell, smoothing her hair as if that would somehow mask the disaster she had become. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, revealing her mother's face. Older than she remembered, lines of worry etched into her skin. "Vanessa?" her mother asked, her voice laced with surprise and something else. Hesitation. "Hi, Mom," Vanessa said, forcing a smile. "Can I come in?" Her mother studied her for a moment before stepping aside, allowing her into the house. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, a scent that had once been so familiar. Nothing had changed inside. The same floral wallpaper, the same cozy furniture. It was as if time had frozen here, while her own life had unraveled. Her father sat in his usual recliner reading the newspaper. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Well, this is a surprise," he said, folding the paper. "To what do we owe the visit?" Vanessa hesitated. She had rehearsed what she would say on the drive over, but now that she was here, standing in front of them, her carefully crafted words felt hollow. I need a little help," she admitted, swallowing her pride. "Things have been difficult." Her mother exchanged a look with her father before gesturing for her to sit down. "What's going on, Vanessa?" And so, for the first time in years, Vanessa told the truth. She told them about Jason leaving, about her frozen bank accounts, about waking up to a life that had vanished overnight. She carefully omitted details about the affair, painting herself as a victim of Jason's sudden cruelty. Her mother listened with a furrowed brow, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her father, however, remained impassive, his gaze sharp and knowing. "So, let me get this straight," he said when she finished. "You spent years looking down on us, on the way we lived, acting like you were above it all. And now that you have nothing, you expect us to bail you out?" Vanessa's face flushed. "Dad, that's not fair. No, Vanessa, what's not fair is that you had a man who gave you everything and you threw it away." His voice was calm but firm. And now you want us to fix it? Her mother placed a gentle hand on his arm. Maybe she just needs a little time to get back on her feet. But her father shook his head. She made her choices. She thought she was smarter than everyone. Now she has to live with the consequences. He turned his gaze back to Vanessa, unyielding. We're not your safety net, Vanessa. We're done being your backup plan. Vanessa stared at them, her heart pounding. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. They were supposed to take her in, comfort her, help her figure out a way forward. Her mother sighed, looking at her daughter with sad eyes. We'll always love you, Vanessa, she said softly. But we can't fix this for you. It was a kindness wrapped in rejection, and it shattered her more than anger ever could. Vanessa stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I see, she said, her voice cold. Thanks for nothing. She turned on her heel and walked out, slamming the door behind her. As she sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel with shaking hands, the truth hit her like a freight train. She had nowhere left to go. Vanessa sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her fingers ached. The rejection from her parents stung in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had walked in expecting them to open their doors, to see her struggle and offer a solution, but instead, they had turned her away, forcing her to face the harsh reality she had been avoiding. She had no safety net, no money, no place to go. For the first time in her life, she was truly, devastatingly alone. Her chest tightened as she stared at the road ahead, her mind spiraling. She needed a plan. Sitting here, wallowing in self-pity, wouldn't change anything. There had to be a way to regain control, to claw her way back to the life she once had. She unlocked her phone and scrolled through her contacts, looking for anyone who might still pick up her call. But each name she passed felt meaningless now. She had surrounded herself with people who thrived on status and wealth, friendships built on luxury rather than loyalty. Now that she had neither, they had vanished like smoke. A desperate thought crossed her mind, Jason. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over his name. Calling him was the last thing she wanted to do, but what other choice did she have? Maybe she could talk to him, make him see reason. Maybe, just maybe, she could convince him to take her back. Before she could overthink it, she pressed the call button and held her breath. The phone rang once, then twice. Then voicemail. She clenched her jaw, quickly dialing again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Frustration boiled in her veins as she slammed the phone onto the passenger seat. Jason wasn't just ignoring her. He had completely erased her from his life. The Jason she had mocked, belittled, and taken for granted had been 3 steps ahead of her all along. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't fix this. She needed a place to stay, at least for the night. House was out of the question. Jason had taken everything. The bank had already told her there was nothing left in her accounts. Her only option was a hotel, but the moment she pulled up a booking app and tried to reserve a room, her card was declined. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. She had never worried about money before. Jason had always taken care of everything, and she had enjoyed the benefits without a second thought. But now, without access to the wealth she had once flaunted, she was no different from anyone else struggling to survive. With no other options, she found herself driving aimlessly through the city. The bright lights of downtown flickered around her, illuminating streets filled with people who still had their lives intact. Couples laughed outside of high-end restaurants. Groups of friends spilled out of bars, and people moved through the night as if the world hadn't just collapsed for her. She pulled into a parking lot near a dimly lit cafe, resting her forehead against the steering wheel. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but she had nowhere to go. The thought of sleeping in her car sent a wave of shame crashing over her. Just days ago, she had been the woman who looked down on those who struggled. Now, she was one of them. Her mind replayed every moment that had led to this downfall, every smug remark she had made to Jason, every time she had laughed at his supposed weakness, every cruel jab about how he could never leave her because he needed her too much. But he had left, and he had taken everything she valued with him. A notification lit up her phone screen. A message from an unknown number. Curious, she swapped it open. Vanessa, I hope you understand now. You were never the one in control. Enjoy the life you built for yourself, Jason. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. Jason had given her every opportunity to be different, to treat him with respect, to value what they had. And instead, she had mocked him, underestimated him, assumed he would always be there, waiting in the shadows, too weak to ever walk away. She had been wrong. A sob escaped her lips, raw and unrestrained. She had nothing left. No wealth, no status, no security. She had spent so long believing she was untouchable, only to find herself abandoned in a dark parking lot with nowhere to turn. For the first time in her life, Vanessa Daniels was powerless.